We are back for the second part of our interview with Professor John Kendle, the author of the Round Table Movement and Imperial Union. We have been discussing the history of the Round Table and its influence, which has long been a matter of controversy.
Indeed it has.
Professor Kendle, in the first segment we were talking about how your description of the Round Table's influence is so different from the way contemporaries and later commentators described it. If I'm not mistaken, you base your opinion on the thesis that the Round Table's principal goal was the federation of the British Empire. Therefore, any activities of Round Table members that did not advance this goal cannot be seen as examples of Round Table influence.
Yes, that's so.
But if it could be shown that the Round Table had other interests and objectives, then you would have to change your conclusions about the extent of its influence.
That would be a logical course to take.
In the earlier segment you mentioned the Round Table's interest in Anglo-American relations. What did the Round Table hope to achieve in this area?
In a broad sense, it wanted improved relations between the United States and Britain. That's hardly an unusual position to take. I'm sure most people today would be naturally in favor of such a thing.
However, that was not the case in the United States in the early 20th century. Irish Americans, for example, were often quite anti-British.
Yes, that's true.
There were also many Americans who disliked the British Empire because they were anti-imperialist, such as Woodrow Wilson's first Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Or they did not believe that the United States should ally itself with European powers.
I agree with that.
So, better Anglo-American relations that might lead to an alliance was something that needed to be promoted, much like an idea like imperial federation.
You could make that argument. What I would point out, however, is that the founders of the Round Table never mentioned improved Anglo-American relations when they established the movement. It was a peripheral issue, especially in the beginning.
That may be so. But wasn't imperial federation really just a means to an end?
A means to an end.
Yes. Didn't federation have a larger purpose, other than just improving the structure of the empire, or giving the dominions a voice in imperial foreign policy?
Well, yes, the overall goal was to strengthen the British Empire, especially in its dealings with Germany.
Wouldn't improved Anglo-American relations have the same objective, to strengthen the British Empire diplomatically and militarily?
Well, yes, of course.
Then couldn't this be a Round Table objective as well? You said that they had failed at the Imperial Conference of 1911, so wouldn't they try other ways to strengthen the British Empire?
Sure, that makes sense. But I'm not sure that you can go far in that direction as regards Round Table influence.
Well, it does go back to the arguments of Professor Quigley, who said that the Round Table exercised influence through groups like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
I believe he went rather overboard by calling them Round Table fronts.
That may be so, but is it really going overboard to argue that the Round Table tried to exercise some influence through them?
What kind of influence are you talking about?
We know that the early Council on Foreign Relations was very interested in promoting internationalism, whereby the United States would take an active role in world affairs. The Round Table Journal also argued for this, especially during World War I. Most of its members also favored closer Anglo-American ties, as did the Round Table.
Hooey.
And then there's the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is now called Chatham House, I believe. It was also committed to internationalism, and its members generally favored good Anglo-American relations. As you know, it was Round Table member Lionel Curtis who was the driving force behind the founding of Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations.
That's all well and good, but I don't think you can go anywhere with it. As I'm sure you're aware, both Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations are prohibited by their charters from expressing opinions of their own. Thus they have never advocated any policies, including an Anglo-American alliance.
True, but that does not prevent other groups from using the Council and Chatham House as a platform from which to espouse policies. So, couldn't the Round Table have promoted its positions through these and other groups, and couldn't that be thought of as influence?
That's just speculation. There's no evidence they ever did.
They never promoted closer Anglo-American relations in their articles, books, or speeches that were published by Chatham House or the Council on Foreign Relations.
On second thought, there are some works I know of that they wrote which touched upon that subject. It's difficult to say, of course, how much influence those projects might have had at the time.
It sounds like an interesting salutary exercise for some young graduate students somewhere.
Ha ha ha, indeed it does.
While we're on the subject of roundtable influence, I'd like to bring up another problem I had when I read your book.
I'd be happy to help you with that.
In most cases that I'm familiar with, political movements generally want to gain power and exercise it to promote their agendas. I think you would agree that the Round Table wanted to have access to power too.
Yes, though perhaps not direct power. They were often quite content to work behind the scenes.
It strikes me as quite odd that you treat their ascension to power in 1916 as a problem for them instead of an opportunity.
Ascension to power. That's overstating things a little.
Let me elaborate on the British political situation at the time for our viewers. When World War I started, the Prime Minister was Herbert Asquith of the Liberal Party. Many members of the Round Table were dissatisfied with his war policies, especially his reluctance to introduce a draft to create larger armies to fight in France. Among the Round Tablers I would mention our Lord Milner, F.S. Oliver, Waldorf Astor, Philip Carr, who formed a ginger group to find ways to topple Asquith and replace him with a stronger leader. The man they tended to promote was David Lloyd George. Now I know that you feel that the ginger group cannot be considered to be related to the Round Table, even though much of the membership overlapped.
That's right. I say that for several reasons. First, the Round Table Journal itself never called for the end of the Asquith government, and the journal was the mouthpiece of the movement. Second, it was a purely British political affairs. No members of the Dominion Round Table groups were involved. Third, Round Table member II.avi was not involved with the group, even though he was a member of Parliament.
Those don't seem like very strong reasons to me.
Why is that?
II.avi's non-involvement seems rather irrelevant to whether the Round Table as a whole was involved with the ginger group. Also, why would groups in other dominions be involved? I don't see what difference their involvement could have made one way or another. And the group itself was a private affair, not a public one. It wouldn't make sense for the Round Table to make public statements about Asquith when its members were trying to undermine the Prime Minister quietly.
You may be right, but I think we're free to disagree with each other.
Yes, we are. Now, in returning to the ginger group, in late 1916 Herbert Asquith was finally removed from power, and Lloyd George became the new Prime Minister.
Yes.
As a result, Lord Milner entered government service again for the first time since 1905, taking a position in the cabinet. Philip Carr and Waldorf Astor both became members of the so-called Garden Suburb, which was a kind of secretariat that advised Lloyd George. Robert Brand joined a government board in charge of increasing munitions. The Round Table had finally gained access to power. And yet...
You are correct. The Round Table did want power, it did want influence. But by entering the government, it lost its ability to influence events.
How is that possible?
It's quite simple, really. First, it was a wartime government. They had to help the British government fight the Germans, for God's sake. They didn't have the luxury of pursuing their own agenda, such as pushing for imperial federation. They were overworked, especially Milner, and they had other things that needed to be done, quite frankly.
So they were just too busy.
In a nutshell, yes. Another problem was that by entering the government, they lost people who could otherwise have been writing articles for or editing the Round Table. Philip Carr, for instance, stopped being the editor so that he could be private secretary to Lloyd George.
You used that word, lost, in your book too. It sounds rather paradoxical to me.
I agree, it is paradoxical.
But if the Round Table had other objectives besides imperial federation, then it might not be so paradoxical. The promotion of Anglo-American relations, for example. Before the war ended, Britain and the United States were everything but formal allies.
Thanks to German submarine warfare and foreign intrigue, not to the Round Table.
And thanks to American Round Table associates like George Louis Beer, who wrote popular articles calling for American intervention on the side of the Allies.
Well, again, it's difficult to assess just how influential men like Beer really were. Probably, however, it was minimal.
By itself, in isolation, you may be right. As part of a wider campaign of British propaganda, it may have had a larger impact.
I don't like to discuss these types of conspiracy theories.
I understand. Let me close by asking you about the reaction your book received when it was published.
In general, it was very well received. I had a number of favorable reviews in historical journals, which were very gratifying for me to read.
Didn't the Round Table review it too?
Yes, they did. I recall that one of the former editors, Harry Hodson, was upset that I gave his name in the book as Harold instead of Henry. I don't know how I managed to miss that when I was editing the manuscript.
Mr. Hodson told one researcher that he thought your book was authoritative for anyone who wanted to know more about the Round Table's history.
Well, then I'm pleased. I'm glad he didn't hold my editing against me.
Do you think your book is authoritative?
Well, I would never use such a sweeping word to characterize my work. But I will say that I think it is a very useful book. For historians of the British Commonwealth, of course.
Are you surprised that there haven't been any other full-scale histories of the Round Table since your book came out? It's been 35 years after all.
No, not really. There has been Leonie Foster's book on the Australian Round Table groups,
for which you wrote the preface.
Ah, yes, I did in fact. Her book and biographies of people like Lord Selborne and Lionel Curtis. There is also the doctoral thesis of Alex May at Oxford University, which he plans to publish some time in the future. But I think that my book covered enough material so that there really isn't a need for another study like mine. I don't think there's much new information to add to what's already known.
With all due respect, Professor Kendle, is that really how history works?
I beg your pardon.
On any given historical topic, there are always different points of view and different interpretations. If you take the Battle of Hastings, for example, or the founding of the League of Nations, there are literally hundreds of books written about these topics. But you write a history of the Round Table, and that's all there is to be said. Your book is authoritative, and that's it?
I never said it was authoritative, and I'd hate it if no one followed up on my work.
Yet, no one has, aside from the occasional biographer and graduate student. Your book has ensured that no one will follow you.
How can you say that? I spent 12 years researching my book, and I went through every source available to me. I laid out the facts as I saw them.
But you interpreted them in a way that discourages future researchers. If, as you say, the Round Table had only minor links to a major historical figure like Lord Milner, and it had no significant influence on major historical events, then why should historians study it?
Because we, by this I mean historians and the public alike, can always learn something from groups like the Round Table. Just because it failed is not a reason to not study it.
But did it fail? Did it fail when it tried to build an Anglo-American alliance? Did it fail by helping to found the Council on Foreign Relations in Chatham House?
Assuming those are examples of Round Table influence, then it should be studied further. I disagree that those are examples, however.
What about the Round Table? Does it agree or disagree with your assessment of its influence?
I'm sure it agrees.
Why does it agree? Because it's historically accurate? Or because the Round Table doesn't want to be the subject of historical investigation? If it really was as influential as someone like Professor Quigley had argued, then there would be quite a lot to study about the Round Table. And if that were true, the Round Table would not like being the subject of that kind of investigation.
Yes, if it were really that influential. But I'm satisfied with my conclusion that it wasn't.
I understand. Well, our time has run out, but I would like to thank you for being my guest and discussing the Round Table with me.
Thank you for having me. It was a very invigorating debate,